Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Denise Daly, Staff Liaison for the NC Realtors Appraisal section. I'm excited that we have a panel of appraisal experts with us today who are going to tell us everything we need to know about appraisals and how they affect your transactions. But before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. First, we will be taking live questions via the chat field. Please submit your questions you have for today's panel there, and they will do their best to address as many as possible. We will also be recording today and will email each of you a link to the recording. I also want to mention that the opinions that the panelists discuss in today's session are the opinions of those individuals and do not represent any association, organization, or board that they are on or a member of. Now, I am honored to welcome today's session host, Peter Gallo, Chair to the NC Realtors Appraisal section, who will kick off today's session for us. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and pass everything over to you.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Denise. So the appraisal section thought it'd be helpful to continue our conversation between broker and agent members and our appraiser members, all who are realtors. Appraisers are realtors too. So that we started this past November to help explain the appraisal process and to demystify what is or is not allowed when an appraiser is hired for one of your transactions. So to get started with our session, I'd like to introduce today's panel. We're joined by Dave Costner, owner of DM Costner and Associates, and Vic Knight, owner of Chapel Hill Appraisals and Consultants. And both are Realtors of the Year. Dave's Realtor of the Year, Gaston Association, and Vic was Realtor of the Year for the Chapel Hill Board of Realtors. Both have been past chair of the appraisal section. Vic has past president of NC Realtors in 2005 and also chaired the North Carolina Real Estate Commission and was involved as an NAR director and chaired the Real Property Valuation Committee. And Dave's been on the NAR Real Property Valuation Committee before as well. So did you both want to just talk about your practice, both geographically and professionally, your areas of coverage? Maybe Dave, you want to start? You're on mute, Dave, just so you know. There you go.
You're gonna have to bear with me. Even through COVID, I still haven't got all this stuff figured out yet.
Yeah.
So I'm a Charlotte area guy. I've been doing this since 1983. I actually started practice as I'd say a broker, but back then, I don't know if they're still around or not, but you could be a broker or a salesman. So I was a real estate salesman. You had to work under someone. And I did, and that someone was Hobart Smith, who owned the ERA franchise in Charlotte. So brokerage wasn't my thing, even though I had a great trainer. Bill Mathers was my trainer. Appraising was, what worked for me. So I've been doing it since '83.
Residentially, you're residential?
Residentially, I don't do any commercial at all. My first appraisals were given standing before a loan board. They would meet on Thursdays, First Federal of something, I can't even remember. But they would meet on Thursdays. I'd stand before the board and they would ask, well, you went out and appraised John Smith's house, didn't you? Well, yeah, I did. Well, how'd it look? Well, it looked fine. Well, we really don't care because we're lending on his character, not necessarily the collateral. And those were my appraisals back in the day. Vic, you probably had some of those back then. So, I've seen it all. I've been around some. It's coming into the twilight of my career. There's been a lot of changes. I've seen a lot of changes. There's probably a good many more coming down the pike.
Thanks, Dave. Vic?
Yeah, you're welcome.
Short version for me. I'm a certified general appraiser. Probably about 60% of my business is what I'll frame as non-residential, but I still do residential work. I do residential work, frankly, enjoy it, but I also am an instructor. I teach pre-licensing, post-licensing, and a lot of continuing education things. And in the continuing education side, I try and meld some of my appraisal experience and brokerage experience into the classroom. So that's mostly what I do. I work in and around the triangle from essentially Alamance County to about Johnson County down into Chatham, doing a variety of things as well. And I have worn a lot of hats in this business. It's my 40th year in real estate business, and thoroughly enjoy it, and hope we can help answer a few questions for our participants today, and see if they can't in turn help their customers and clients not only better understand the appraisal process, but help in achieving the understanding that puts the properties that they're listing and representing in the best light for the most favorable appraisal outcome.
Thanks, Vic. So, so for the attendees, we have some questions that were submitted from registration for this event, but we'll also be watching the chat. I see there's a question already from Paula, but we'll try to get as many as possible. And so one of the first main concerns that we've had and questions for these Ask an Appraiser webinars has been, just communicating with the appraiser, what's allowed, what's not allowed. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. You can talk to the appraiser. The big difference is before the report's done and after the report's done. So do you guys want to address that? I know, Vic, you've done a lot on this. You've written some stuff. Do you want to maybe just frame this conversation a little bit for us?
Sure, be glad to. As I believe most everybody might recognize, a identification for a congressional act called Dodd-Frank, passed in 2010, really changed the lending world because of the regulations that came into play, outcome from the Great Recession of that period. Shortly thereafter, and part of the Dodd-Frank, created a new federal agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's not terribly important, other than they have a tremendous amount of regulatory power for the lenders. And there's some language in Dodd-Frank that specifically states that all parties, consumers, real estate practitioners, borrowers, and others need to respect the appraisal process that's identified in USPAP, one of the standards that the appraisers have to manage. Short version of the rest of it is there's language in Dodd-Frank that allows for some communication to the appraiser to correct errors, give additional information about the property or things like that, once the appraisal has been submitted to the client. And what you have to do is look at this as what I'll call the window of opportunity. Once that window begins to close, the ability to have more conversations with the appraiser also shrinks along with it. And then once the report is submitted to the client for the appraiser is the lender, and that window is essentially shut. To take advantage of that, the best way to manage that would be to have conversations, potential conversations with appraisers as they might be visiting the property that's the subject of the appraisal process. And I have created a couple of handouts that Denise and Rachel and Peter and Dave can share with others, called the Appraisal Package. I wrote an article both for the National Association in 2013 and then updated that a little bit. It was an article in the Real Estate Bulletin that'll share that kind of information. And there's a lot of things that are there. Might take a little longer than, Peter, you might want me to go into, that you as a broker representing the property that's for sale need to have an opportunity to share that information with the appraiser. And I'll close with this concept. The concept is the appraiser in a typical residential appraisal inspection is going to spend maybe about an hour, might be a little less, might be a little longer, depending on how large or how complex the property is, doing the appraisal inspection. And you, as the broker that's representing this property, has probably spent a lot more time there, having many more conversations with the seller, understanding a lot more about the neighborhood and that local market. And developing that appraisal package is an opportunity to share with the appraiser various pieces of information about the particular unique attributes of these properties and those characteristics that the appraiser might not have as much time to simply acquire as you might have been able to develop. And you might want to take that concept and think about reading some of the information that we'll provide you a little bit later related to this appraisal package. But there are very legitimate ways, legal ways to have a conversation with appraisers. You just have to do it in the very early stages as opposed to once the report is completed and sent to the client. That window of opportunity will then have closed.
So there's before the report is done, the CMA, if you've done a CMA, it's all information, factual information that the agent or the listing agent or the did to list the property. Or we don't want to get into conversations of we really need this value with and only giving certain sales that point to that. Appraisers want information, and appraisers are adept at being able to guide you through that conversation or what kind of information you need. But yes, when the appraisal's done, report results can only be discussed with the client, which is usually the lender, right, Dave? So Dave, what's your kind of perspective on information that you're okay with getting and how you handle it yourself?
Well, appraisers live and die by data. So, our reports are heavily data driven. There's certain things that the report asks for that we have no way of knowing unless the seller, if they're home, or the broker can provide us. For instance, the report asks us specifically, if there have been any updates to kitchens or baths over the past 15 years, and they want us to include that time frame within our reports. Of course, that's a material fact, and it'll make a difference in the report. It'll make the difference in our C rating, which is our condition rating that we assign the subject as well as the comparable properties that we use to compare the house to. So, it's good to know that information. If you can provide that in your appraisal packet, I always want to see a copy of your CMA because it gives me an idea of what you're thinking. And even though I may not agree with or would choose some of the properties that you may have chosen in your CMA, at least if I missed something in the market, if there was something that I overlooked, well, you've provided it. It's available for us at that point. Excuse me, go ahead.
And that answers Natalie. Natalie, you were asking, what are your thoughts on sharing our comps? I mean, anything you can share. It's up to us whether we'll consider them to include in our report, but certainly your CMA, right? Dave,
that's absolutely true. So because if Pete, Vic, and I all did an appraisal on the same house, and say it's not in a subdivision, or let's say it's in a huge subdivision like Berwick and Charlotte, it's quite likely that each of us will have at least one different comparable property on the listing, because this is not like sending a man to the moon where the math is immutable and has to be exact. There's a little bit of our work to appraise. It's sort of like you put your spouse and your mother and your mother-in-law in the kitchen and tell them to make a meatloaf, and they're all going to make a meatloaf. Probably you're going to have to agree that your mom's is the best, but they all do it a little bit different. The ingredients might be a little different, or the time being baked in the oven. So it's the same with us. Is going to be the same, but there's different methodology that we use when we're developing our values.
Right, and so the discipline of appraising came from the practice of real estate. It wasn't the other way around. So it's not like the appraisals are magic. We're all dealing with the same data. We might be more refined in what we do as appraisers, but it really comes from what's happening in the market. And who asked about in the beginning, I'm sorry, Paula, about adjustments for time. So there's a couple questions about, okay, so the market that we've seen with the houses selling over list, just a lot of really craziness going on. And now we're actually looking at rising interest rates, and we're seeing some changes in the market. I mean, I know in our office, we're starting to look at actives and things are changing. But up until, so what do we look at when we see something that sells either above a contract? So let's talk about contract versus value, because they could be the same, but a contract price is not necessarily market value. And then let's talk about how we approach trends and consistent trends and deriving maybe a time adjustment out of it. Vic, you want to try and tackle, or either you have a comment on that?
Well, I'm trying to track a couple of the various points, and I won't belabor the appraisal package a lot more. I shared that with Denise earlier today, and Denise, you're welcome to post that last document I sent you earlier about the outline, the summary outline of things for the appraisal package. But one of those other topics I think I heard you mention, Peter, was the adjustments for time. It might have been stated a little bit differently, but I believe what was asked was we have a comparable that closed. So now it's June, latter part of June. It closed in January at a certain price, might even be in the neighborhood, may be very similar property. How do you make an adjustment? Well, it's a time-related item. There are some databases that can be utilized about appreciation, probably more along the lines of inflation, about as much as anything, but housing appreciation has been fairly strong. The number of these databases exist, national to statewide and local. As a purely reference point for a brief discussion, national average, and that shouldn't mean anything specifically to one subdivision, but national average in North Carolina has been 20.55% over the year of 2021. That's pretty darn substantial. Now, that doesn't mean that every single neighborhood or every single property would have either appreciated to that level or not. But then you might use some characteristic of an appreciation of anywhere from maybe a 1%, maybe down to 0.5%, could be easily 1.5%, depending on that local market. But appraisers are allowed to do that if they can substantiate that from a data standpoint. So there have to be some kind of a reference, some kind of known point to begin with that could be identified. But there are ways of addressing that particular issue within the report, and it's acceptable to the market, to the lenders, our clients, so long as there's a sound reference point that can be legitimized.
And that's the key with adjustments, is they need to be supported, and different appraisers do it differently. But as long as the reader can tell where you're coming from and what you're doing, right, Dave?
What Vic said, I will actually run off copies of my reports and put them into the appraisal. You know, we all know that the best comp is the house next door that sold yesterday. So, if you've got good enough data, good enough recent data, it's much better to use that than try to develop a time adjustment over, several months in a, rapidly increasing market. Users of Matrix probably know about the statistical analysis marketing feature. We call it SAM. It's on the homepage of Matrix. And I'm sure that, I would imagine that most of the MLSs have something similar, but it's easy enough to go into that module and extract some data as far as the time frame goes. But yeah, you can't just make an adjustment and put it in a report. You have to justify your decisions and prove to the underwriter who's actually looking at this report that that adjustment is justified. So, but it's best practice to use more recent sales if they're available in a rapidly changing market.
So, and it always comes up, everybody wants to know, can we have your list of adjustments?
Oh, you have a list of adjustments. Yeah.
So, but one thing too, so we'll get back to that, but just another note on time adjustments is, I know with new construction, you have to look at the contract and, of your comps, the contract date versus, because a lot of new construction, went under contract 6 months ago, might have gone into contract in November, and it might have closed this month, but you really have to look at when was the price set and look in the MLS maybe at its history. And that price is most likely was set at the time of contract. And where you're at now, the market might have significantly changed. So that you need to consider what you're basing your adjustment. And again, it goes to supporting what you're doing. Appraisers can do what they want as long as they support it within, if it makes sense. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You just can't make adjustments willy-nilly and, expect them to pass muster. You have to actually do your homework. And we do. That's what we get paid for.
Right.
So I'll add for this adjustment question that kind of is being asked in chat. As Dave mentioned, depending on which MLS you are a member of, or MLSs that you might be members of, most of the MLSs have some statistical information that they track internally within our MLSs. In the triangle, we break that down into a variety of other subsets of information, statistical information, like by county, in some cases by city, or other things about the appreciation that is taking place, days on market, lots of things to consider. And I believe brokers should pay attention to those statistical pieces of information. It's quite beneficial, particularly when you are talking to sellers about pricing their properties. And you need to have a competitive price, or the market might not look favorably upon the property. At the same time, I also recognize that the market is very vibrant, and there are many cases where just to get a home under contract might take a little extra nudge, meaning a little extra dollars on the table to acquire that contract. And one of the questions was, how do you make the adjustment for that? Well, that's not a market issue. It's not a statistical verifiable issue. And there are probably more cases than not that the property is not going to appraise for the purchase price, because that's not what the appraiser's function is. They're supposed to be developing, and I mean that word literally, developing their opinion, impartial, objective, independent of any other influences, and they're going to use market data. And just because a buyer wants to pay a little extra money just to get this one house, that's not a market data driven statistic that can be verified. So there are going to be those cases where your buyers, and quite frankly, even the sellers, are going to have to recognize that the property may not appraise for that purchase price, because that's not what the function of the appraiser is.
Yeah. So So, and again, just to go back to this list of adjustments, just to make it laughing, it's how we have to support. It's going to be different. Most likely there might be within a certain range for bathrooms. It might be some of that just straightforward stuff. Baths, garages might be, more of a check mark adjustment than anything else. But, adjustments are fine tuning, right? I mean, it's not, what's really important is the selection of the comparables. So when we have some of these unusual properties, either they're on a lake, there's some kind of external issue or benefit, golf course, or like somebody was mentioning, it's an older home and maybe a newer neighborhood, or vice versa, it's a newer home in an older neighborhood. You can't put, sometimes you can't put 3 or 6 comps together that are all the same. So you got to kind of mix it up, right? So how do you guys approach unique properties? Because appraisers kind of do it all different, but the same. So Dave, you want to?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and I'm sure Vic has his thoughts on it too. But when I'm looking at a house with an unusual feature, and maybe there's an external issue, and a lot of times it comes up, especially in the Charlotte market, and some of the newer subdivisions, they will build, where there's lots of high tension power lines, and towers. And if you got a house that backs up to one of those, it's obvious that there's going to be a marketing issue to some degree. Well, the lender wants to know what that issue is going to be. So the best way that I have found to account for that is to find a sale that has that same issue. I'll look, and a lot of times it's not listed that, that there's a high tension power tower in the rear of the property. That's something probably that people will avoid actually when they're listing their property. So, I'll start looking on the map. I'll pull up my comparables. It'll show them on the map, and I'll pull it up to see if I can find one that has the same issue. Well, once I do that, then I can use that sale as a baseline and see, well, this sale sold, this much lower than the typical sale, throughout the rest of the neighborhood. It's called match data pairing. So everything else equal, if all things are equal about these two homes, except for the one item, then you can attribute the difference in value generally to that one item. So, and that will apply to, I saw somebody put the dome house or the 200-year-old house to a, that's going to be a little bit different in that lenders are going to require a little bit more out of you, for very unusual homes like a berm house. You're going to have to find a similar property to put in your report. But we use match data pairing and regression analysis, which is a statistical analysis, that which determines relationships of a fixed point to variable points. And so we will know the difference in value for those things. That's pretty easy explanation that I just gave. The dome house, your lender is going to require you, if you can't find a dome house, which I've never seen a dome house. I've seen one, actually, there's one in Beaumont where I live, but I've never seen one come for sale. I've never seen one as comp. So the lenders are going to require that you have something unusual, even if you can't find a dome house. Maybe you could use a berm house as a comp, or a spaceship house. It's just something unusual, something odd that might be similar in the minds of the buyer, which is part of what we do. We're supposed to get our heads wrapped around the thinking of the typical buyer, so we can show that on an appraisal report that there is a market for such a property. So clear as mud, Pete.
Right. So it doesn't have to be exactly, if it was a water tower, maybe you want to get something else with another external type of influence, like a through road, and be able to explain it. But same kind of scenario, Vic. How do you approach kind of unusual And the best comp is the one with the least amount of adjustments, right? And we kind of look at that as a weighting factor. Sometimes the answer from an appraiser is that there's always qualifiers, right, Vic?
Sure. Well, there was a question in here a little bit ago, just kind of looking at that, was asking about how you prioritize one comp over another. Well, Dave mentioned this earlier, where the best comparable that you could find would be the exact house that you're looking at, your subject property, is actually another one just like it next door that closed yesterday. Well, that's a great comp. You're just not going to find very many of those. It literally is rare, but you're trying to find the most similar property. Similar is a very broad term, but similar in as many of the characteristics that the subject property has, you're trying to find comps that have the most similar characteristics. Maybe you have, it has a swimming pool. Well, we're going to look at a lot of properties that have swimming pools, if possible. Maybe it has some below grade space. Going to look at properties that have below grade space. You're trying to just simply find those similarities and then make adjustments. And as Peter just said, once we find those properties, that comparable that has the least number of adjustments is probably the most similar. And I only make that point because in the reconciliation process, when we're finally trying to use our best knowledge and the information that we've been able to gather, statistical, comparable, and otherwise, we're going to look at and give a little more priority to the comparable that is similar, like Peter said, has the least adjustments. It's in a broad term, it's called weighting. And you don't average all these together. You're going to look at the one that's probably has that least adjustments, most similar, and give it a little more weight to it, and then reconcile in the direction of that. Typically, a little more so.
And so one sale does not make a market, right? So we have to be careful with especially when we get a lot of feedback from the participants in the transaction about our report. They send it to the lender, and they might send one or two sales, and they're just the highest or just the lowest because they're trying to lower that appraised value because they don't want that high appraisal, right? So I'm being facetious there. So most of the time, we'll, for a reconsideration of value things, and somebody brought this up before, how do we, after the report is complete, how do we then, and the door is closed, and we might get a copy, how do we address that? And that's the lender, that has to go through the client, and the client, who normally is the lender in a mortgage transaction, usually has a process for that called reconsideration of value. But we can't just, you send us, again, this goes to that appraisals aren't magic. We're all dealing with the same data. You can't just, to be credible, you can't just send us just the highest sales and think that that's going to influence us, because the appraiser needs to look at all the sales in the market. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Once you hit the nail on the head. One sale does not create a value. It just doesn't work that way. So we have to. Well, there's 3 sales at a minimum on the report. So and possibly more in a changing market. It's not unusual to include properties that are under contract. As secondary comparable sales.
Right. And we use pendings. We appraisers in this market, we're looking at pendings and listings, the competition that's occurring at this moment. And then we're putting that all together. It might not all be in the report. It's certainly in our work file. But then when we go to report it, you get those end trends, and that might be the final variable that we've come up with from the research that we've done.
Let me make a point, and someone asked a question about essentially selecting comps. And I was talking about trying to find the comps that are the most similar. But there's a very legitimate question that probably most brokers don't understand, and even some appraisers maybe for that matter. But one of the considerations that the lender, our client, asks is this particular subject property, is it in an urban location, a suburban location, or a rural location? One of the questions was, is it better to have a comp that closed 8 months ago in nearby, same subdivision or something, versus a exact similar home, but it's 10 miles away? Well, depends on where the subject property is. If it's an urban location, there are some limits that are placed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those are the secondary market gorillas that are out there that buy these loans, about how far you can go to select comps. So it depends on where the property is. If it's a rural location, it would not be unusual in the rural places that I do business in to go 4, 5, 6, and as much as 10 miles to find similar properties. But they also still have to be similar. So selecting a comp is actually much more important than where it's located, but you've got to still keep in consideration, is that urban, meaning there's a lot of dense housing here? Is it suburban, not quite as dense, but is it rural where properties are great distances apart? Will drive the answer to that question every single time. So I just want to make that point to you. The other thing, Peter, you kind of touched on is this concept about, and David said the same thing, concept about these comps. The reason that at a minimum, the lenders want 3 comparable sales is because 2 comps, comp 1 and comp 2, all that does is create a line, some type of a direction of value. 3 comps create a trend, and that's what the lender wants, because the 3 will actually tell us not it's just a line, it's where's that line pointing, what direction, what trend is it going in. So that's why they want 3 comps, and 4 comps is even better, and 10 comps is even better than that.
Right, because what we're doing, it's statistical analysis, and most appraisers have a background in that, and it's included in your coursework for qualifying education, especially in North Carolina. But I wanted to, Nancy had a question that I think really is important for us to address. Is it really possible to get an appraisal change? What is the best approach to do this and not offend the appraiser when we really think a mistake was made? So we already touched on after you need to go to the lender. But so it's very important to get any information you can to that appraiser before the reporting is done. And you want to get it before, at, or during development of the appraisal. So that would usually your window of opportunity, like Vic said, is at when the appraiser is coming out to observe the property. You don't want to say it's a low appraisal. It's inaccurate, it's not credible, it's not reliable. That's where you want to focus your efforts and what you want to address. And therefore, by it not being accurate, again, appraisals aren't magic. You need to provide information that maybe the appraiser wasn't aware of. It didn't show up in the multiple listing system, or something. If you truly think a mistake was made, it's black and white. I mean, there isn't anyone who doesn't want to address that, including the appraiser. So it's really a requirement of appraisers that once they find out if they made an error, to immediately change it, whether they find it or somebody else finds it. So do you want to address that before, after, and how you see the best way to interact, any advice you can give our attendees on how to interact with the appraisers?
Yeah, Pete, I'll say the best thing to do is what Vic said earlier is, go download you need to really go download Vic's article, because you need to do the things that we need to see prior to us going to this property, or at the same time. Once we've submitted this report, your options are down to essentially not a whole bunch, unless we've made an error. And Pete said, yeah, if we made an error, we want to know. I mean, because we want to correct our error. Nobody wants an appraisal report out there in the ether forever, with they show up sometime later on. So it's in everybody's best interest for us to correct that error. You do have to realize that, when we're developing our appraisal and, when we essentially finish it and, give our opinion of value, we've done a lot of work at that point. And generally, the information that we've got is the same information you have. Now, it's still entirely possible, but generally not likely, but entirely possible we may have missed a sale. So if you think there's a sale out there, and Pete said earlier, don't go get the highest sale, because we're going to see immediately that, what you're trying to do. Give us that sale and some others that you think, might support your cause. We probably already seen them, but we may not have. It's worth the effort if you think that this, because you're a professional practitioner too. So you see this sale and it's not on there and it's got you scratching your head. It's possible we may have missed it. So ROVs, or a revision of value request. So I saw somebody put that they've never had one work. This is because we do our homework. That's the reason. We generally do it right the first time. You have a much better chance with an ROV, if we've made an error. But believe me, if you see a listing that absolutely you cannot figure out why it's not in the report, that needs to be submitted to the lender, who will then give it to the appraiser to report on.
Let me add, if you don't
Vic,
mind. Go ahead.
First, real quick, Vic, I know you're going to answer this, but can you also, when you answer that, touch a little on basements? Because that's something I want to move into there. There's always questions on basements, on how to handle basements. So I
Okay.
mean to interrupt you, but because we're coming down on the last 15 minutes here.
Sure. So I want to piggyback on Dave's concept. So think for brokers, think about you're trying to do a CMA, credible CMA. You want to gather the best data that's available for you to give that information to your seller client to help market this property for the maximum value that the current market will pay for that property. Well, the appraisers is doing the same thing. And Dave mentioned that in many cases, we're using, if not the same database, particularly in the residential world, that you're using. So it becomes important when you have a sale, or for that matter, even with a listing, that you're actually putting as much information as you have available to yourself into the listing, like in the document section. Dave mentioned any upgrades, bathrooms, kitchens, other sorts of things. List those out. You might even include what some of the costs were and when they were completed. But personally, my biggest soapbox issue about MLS, residentially speaking, is photographs. I actually am just terribly, not just annoyed, but I'm perplexed in many cases where brokers simply choose to put 3, 4 photographs in it and no more photographs. That's not actually doing your client very much good, but it's also not doing you any good as someone who's trying to find data to then use as a comparable in your CMA, much less when I'm doing the appraisal work. Photographs, proverbial 1,000 words for every picture is more easily told. Front of the home, rear of the home, all kinds of things. So I'm a big proponent of that. But all the documentation is typically available to most of us to put information into the listing itself including some of that documentation. So I just want to piggyback onto that just a little bit. Somebody also asked a question related to unpermitted areas. You need to identify that, particularly in comparables, as there's X number of square feet that's unpermittable. That does not mean that that unpermitted space didn't contribute some kind of value, but it would be important to know that it was a certain amount of unpermitted space. You need to disclose that in your listings for sure, because it's a material fact issue. But to pick comparables that are more similar are the basic concept. Go back to Peter's question related to basements. Basements is a word that gets used for almost everything. I'm going to change the wording a little bit just to call it below grade space. There are requirements that became effective April 1st of this year that require appraisers, when they're doing measurements and particularly providing sketches of properties, have to now abide by a national standard. It's called ANSI. That shouldn't mean a thing to anybody other than it's just an acronym. American National Standards Institute, Z765. That is a actual written standard. It was developed by the Home Builders Association. And quite frankly, it is a basis, one of the documents that we used when we wrote the square footage guidelines from the Real Estate Commission years ago. There's a lot of similarity between those two. They're not the same, but there's a lot of similarities that are there. But it's a requirement that now we appraisers have to abide by. And in doing so, you've got to identify the sections that are above grade different than below grade. In fact, the report, the standard URAR form, which is a form that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac developed, meaning it's not a form that Vic made up or Dave made up or Peter made up. It's a form that the industry, the lender, our client said, you have to use this form. And when you do, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac specifically dictate to the appraiser, you've got to identify the below grade space differently than you do the above grade space. That does not mean there's a difference in value. It just means you have to identify it separately. So I think the basis of Peter's question to me was, how do you do that? Well, it goes back to the concept we started off with this morning, and that is you're trying to find the most similar comparables you can. If it's finished below grade space, you want to find comparables that have finished below grade space. If that doesn't exist, you're going to find the next best comparable that might not have below grade space, and then do the paired analysis that Dave mentioned earlier to determine this is what the market's paying for this type of characteristic or attribute that the house has. I don't know that I can probably, without spending a whole lot of time, going a lot further into that, but Peter, I hope that at least opens for more conversation.
No, well, so, you know, you have a 4,000 square foot 2-story with 2,000 square foot on each level. A ranch, a 2,000 square foot ranch with a 2,000 square foot basement is not the same. It's not. So you want to find comparables that are similar in style. You have a colonial, a 2-story. You want to see other 2-stories. That's your first approach, because a lot of, I think that just the basis of like what you said, Vic, is, and you really need to look at what's available in the market, but you want to separate out kind of the anomalies of the properties and focus on the really important, what the market sees as the similarities first, and then start addressing things like basements or pools or unusual. So I'm from Buffalo originally. Every house had a basement, so it was a normal kind of thing. When you come down to North Carolina, you know, that's not the case. So basements are a little bit more unusual. And so you need to focus on what is the most common and what the market's reacting to the most first, and then deal with pole barns and other types of unusual characteristics of a property. Dave, do you have any comments?
Back on to what Vic was saying, that there's no rule that says that we can't evaluate the basement any different than we do the upper level. I've seen plenty of walkout basements on the lake, from Lake Norman and Lake Wiley both, where the lower level is just as nice as the upper level. So, there's no reason that would have to be valued any less. We just have to show it in a different location on our form. Fannie Mae used to be, a long time ago, and I guess it's still the same, was the general rule of thumb is if the soles of your shoes are below ground level on that level, then that entire level is considered to be basement. It has to be evaluated differently. So typically, like I said, on the lake, those are most likely a lot of times going to have a similar value. But you can get into amateur finished basements. Somebody buys it and goes in and slaps up some paneling and throws some vinyl on the floor and drop tile ceilings. Obviously, the value for something like that wouldn't be the same as for the production level, upper level that the builder put in. So we do have to make our adjustments, in quality, which would be our adjustments in cost or price rather, per unit area for that level.
And that's we're talking about contributory value of an item, so like a pool, like you just said, a basement could be a liner pool versus a gunite. It could be a whole part of a whole finished basement level, lower level area that goes out, and there's a pool and a golf course view or a boat dock, and all those together. That would be different from just sticking a pool. You have a 5-acre parcel and you stick a pool somewhere on it, and how that contributes is going to be different than that whole kind of interconnected. And so it depends, right?
Sure.
Go ahead, Vic.
Piggyback on Peter's point, not to change the terminology, but I want to at least give brokers another concept to keep in mind. And there was a question here a minute ago about a pole barn. The concept is, how much did that pole barn contribute to value? And that's what Peter mentions, contributory value. Think about how the market reacts to anything. An upgraded kitchen versus in comp number 1 versus a not upgraded kitchen in comp number 2. What is the market willing to pay for those two things? If we spend enough time looking at just kitchens, you probably can determine exactly what that is. Essentially, that's what Dave's comment was about paired analysis. But you as a broker should be able to, and it may take a few years of experience, but should be able to recognize on any property that you walk on, is you look at the property and say, what is the market willing to pay for this contribution? It might be unique and it might not, but what's it willing to pay for these particular characteristics and attributes that will help you in determining a list price, best price for your seller, your client? Well, it's the same concept that appraisers are using. And it might be a pole barn, it might be a swimming pool, might be a circular drive, it could be 2-story versus another style. It's just, what is the market willing to pay? What is the contribution of value by this particular characteristic or attribute that the property has? I hope that helps somebody a little bit in considering that, particularly as they're developing their own CMAs.
So you were talking about circular driveways. There are some features that contribute absolutely nothing. I had a guy that was really proud of his brand new exposed aggregate driveway. When I went to do the appraisal on his house, cost him $45,000 to put in that exposed aggregate driveway. He's like, well, how much more do you think this is going to bring for my house? And I was like, well, what did you replace it? What was here? He said, it's a concrete driveway. I said, well, you've still got a concrete driveway. It's got pebbles in it. Is the market going to see a $45,000? No, the market, and that's my call. You know, there were some people that may do it, but remember, we're trying to get our head into the mind of the typical buyer. Typical buyer, probably even in that neighborhood, which is a nice neighborhood, still wouldn't see $45,000 worth of value in such an unusual and highly specialized improvement.
And somebody just asked a question about Airbnb. I'll make a slight comment just because there's a lot of conversation nationally about secondary properties on property. Let me change that phrase. Let's call it mother-in-law suites, or an apartment that's been attached to the home or attached to the property somehow. And it's the same thing about the contribution of value. If that's a regular income producing portion of this property, it's the same concept. And if it's a regular part of the property, then you would consider it that way. If it's not a regular part of the property, then it's just the mother-in-law suite. But everything contributes something to value, and that's what you need to take into consideration.
And again, this goes back to kind of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac when it comes to residential mortgage lending appraisals. Control everything, and our form doesn't necessarily, the URAR, the 1004 form that most appraisers use or most clients require, don't necessarily go into all that. And Fannie and Freddie really don't. They want to focus on the sales comparison approach, but the appraiser is trained in all three approaches of value, which is the market approach, which is sales comparison, the income approach, and the cost approach. And the forms that are used don't really go into that or report on those approaches. I mean, the income approach is like 2 lines in the report, and the cost approach is this brief, but the appraiser can still utilize those approaches and have that information in their work file. And when it comes to new construction, sometimes you have to really trying to get the cost approach to be used more, especially, with mortgage lending in some of these scenarios where costs and the markets are just kind of going a little crazy. But then we're supposed to be able to reconcile those three. We're supposed to reconcile those 3 approaches and any other indicators, and that's our final. But do you guys want to say, because I was going to get into we're kind of out of time, but desktop versus, because Fannie and Freddie are kind of going into these desktops and property data collection versus the appraiser. Any quick comments on those types of things or those types of reports?
I'm going to make just a quick comment, and that's all it is brokers are going to actually just have to recognize that the world of residential appraising is changing, and it's changing a lot. And the types of reports, the methodologies that appraisers are going to have to be utilizing are going to change right along with it. I wish I had enough time, for that matter, had enough knowledge to use my crystal ball to tell you what it's going to be tomorrow. I don't have any idea. I just know it's going to change. And the types of reports that you're going to see and how they're developed are also going to change right along with it. And it has nothing to do with what the appraiser wants to do. It has everything to do with what the regulatory bodies, particularly the lender's regulatory side of the transaction, are going to require of the appraiser to do, because that's what our client asks us to do. And you're going to have to recognize it. We're going to have to recognize it, but it's going to change.
Dave, any comments?
Well, just let me say this, because I want to say this before, and I'm going to forget. So I'm going to tell you now. Be very careful when you're pricing your house and using a multiplier, dollar per square foot. It's not best practice, and there's a bunch of reasons for it. But I'll tell you now the best reason. You could have 2 houses side by side that are 1,000 square feet, and one of them sold. But one of them might have a pool, a garage. You could have a hangar, and you'll be on the fairway of a golf course. So if you're just using $1 per square foot, you're not accounting for all those additional features that one house may have. So you're either going to be way high or way low. You need to account for the additional features before you make whatever price per square foot adjustment that you use. Because I see so many in my ROVs, I'll get back. You just use a ridiculously low dollar per square foot to make your adjustments on these appraisals. But you got to keep in mind, by the time we make GLA, a square footage adjustment, we're adjusting for the least expensive portions of a house because we've accounted for the other things in the report. We've accounted for the lot, we've accounted for the condition, the quality, fireplaces, garages. By the time we're adjusting for square footage, we're adjusting for sheetrock and roofing shingles, timber, that kind of stuff. So that's why you see our adjustments a lot lower than the typical broker will use per square foot to price a house. My point is, be careful when you do that. Account for the features that your subject may have versus whatever you're using to compare it to make that adjustment. Okay, that's it. I'm off my
Okay, all right. All right, well, thanks, Vic and Dave. And I want to apologize to Vic because I know I told him this was just going to be a breakfast chat between Dave and I, and I didn't mean to throw him on with 300 people. But Dave and I needed some legitimacy. We needed somebody else with some
Vic gives us our legitimacy.
with his resume, right? The only thing I have on my resume is that I've stayed out of trouble for the last week to 10 days. So thank you guys. Thank you, Vic, Dave. And so I just want to tell everybody, so maybe Denise could tell us a little bit more about the appraisal section and how to join, but you do not have to be an appraiser to be a member of our appraisal section. We need your voice. We want to hear from brokers and agents, and being part of the appraisal section can help us and can help you understand and be involved in the appraisal process and the appraisal voice for NC Realtors. So Denise, you want to maybe just wrap it up and let everybody know how they can do that?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. I hope this session was beneficial in some small way. And I think our section is always willing to provide credible information whenever we can.
Thanks, Vic.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Rachel will provide a link in the chat that brings you to the membership application. And like Peter said, any realtor member who has an interest in the appraisal industry is invited to join. Appraiser's license is not required for membership. And, one of the most significant membership benefits is having the NC Realtors lobbyists representing the appraisal section at both the General Assembly and the North Carolina Appraisal Board. You receive live updates during the appraisal section meetings from the North Carolina Appraisal Board and NAR's Real Property Valuation Committee. Our quarterly e-newsletters address current issues impacting the profession, and they keep you, informed of state and federal issues. So please consider joining. It's just $35 a year, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. It's ddaly, DDALY, at ncrealtors.org. And I think that concludes our session.
Hey, so we could call this an appraisal section meeting and have all our participants, we could outshine the legislative committee and say that we had 300 attendees.
There you go.
So I'd like a motion to adjourn.
8 seconds.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Vic.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.